It's February 21st, 2022. 18-year-old Valeria has just gotten home from a party in central Chernihiv, the northern Ukrainian city that's been her hometown for all of her life. She kicks off her shoes, gets herself a glass of water, and opens her laptop, when there's a knock on the door. Valeria may be an aspiring photographer, but for now she's still living with her parents, and one of her brothers has just barged into the room. "What do you want?" she asks in a tone that would seem hostile to anyone who doesn't know that they're siblings. Aside from her brother, it's quiet in Chernihiv, a city of just under 30,000 inhabitants, about 130 kilometers northeast of Kyiv. These inhabitants don't know it yet, but the next 2 months are going to be the worst of their lives. Cultural heritage is going to be lost forever. Their stadium, university, and city library will be completely destroyed. More than 700 civilians are going to be killed. Valeria, her parents, and 2 family friends will spend months in a bunker with unsteady power supply, rarely any warmth, and the constant fear of death hanging over their heads. Valeria's brother will have died in battle, defending his hometown. When Russian troops withdrew from Chernihiv in early April, Valeria had already fled the war to Italy. She was one of the more than 150,000 inhabitants of Chernihiv and 8 million Ukrainians who, as I'm researching this in December 2022, will have been forced to flee their country. Chernihiv was awarded the title of Hero City after the Russian army withdrew, a military honor created by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to honor cities which had to face extreme hardship. Not that this signaled the end of Chernihiv's experience of war. Russia is still lobbing missiles at it from time to time. But none of that has happened yet. Valeria is still scrolling on her laptop in the bedroom she grew up in, her brother bursting into the room. "Have you seen the clips?" he asks, and excitedly shoves his phone in her face. It's not the usual TikTok-driven excitement Valeria knows and is mostly fond of. When she looks up and sees his face, she realizes that her younger brother is afraid. Valeria takes his phone, presses play, and for the first time of many watches what will soon be referred to as Putin's, quote, address concerning the events in Ukraine. Valeria doesn't know it yet, but a clock has started ticking. Slowly, steadily, it has been counting down towards the end of the only life she has ever known. When she first watched that video, it had already been ticking for some time. The first time I heard of Valeria's story, the war in Ukraine had already been going on for a long time itself. I came across her book, 24th of February, and the Sky Wasn't Blue Anymore, published by an Austrian company. Valeria has documented all of her experiences online, the story of a European teenage girl in the 21st century, a digital native and creative professional who was faced with the reality of war brought upon her home. Publishing short, oftentimes humorous videos, Valeria isn't just finding a way to cope with her own loss and trauma, she's creating a sense of what it means to be Ukrainian for millions of people. She's filming her mother preparing vareniki, a kind of dumpling traditional to Ukraine, in a bunker, posting videos of buildings in her hometown before and after they were destroyed by Russian forces, raising funds for individuals whose homes or bodies have been destroyed by the Russian assault. Valeria is just one of many Ukrainians, young and old, who, despite or even because of the loss and pain that they're experiencing, are defining the narrative of good and evil in a war which, from the Western perspective, which I'm definitely also going to propagate here, one clear aggressor, Vladimir Putin's Russia. But what Valeria and so many of her compatriots are doing is also happening on the other side of the border. Starting with Putin's address on February 21st, pro-Russian media has advanced an entirely different narrative. And this narrative is rooted in a view of the history of Russians and Ukrainians and how they relate to one another, which is fundamentally incompatible with the Ukrainian narrative. History, in other words, is being used as a justification for this war. How did this history come about? And I don't mean the facts that happened, these narratives, these books, this version of history. How was it created? How can it be used for what have convincingly, in my opinion, been described as genocidal war aims? The clock counting down to the beginning of the war on February 24th had been ticking a long time before Valeria first watched Putin's address to Russia's citizens. But when did it start? Who started the countdown? Should we have been more concerned by how Russians view Russian-Ukrainian, pan-Slavic history, and if so, since when? Should we have seen this war coming? And how is it even possible for two countries that share a border, whose history, language, and culture are so closely intertwined, to develop national identities that are so fundamentally contradictory? The answer, of course, lies in a new answer to that old question of whose land is this land? Part 5. Ukraine. Let's go back to the basics for a minute. What did I mean when I said that Ukrainian and Russian, quote, language, culture, and history is closely intertwined? Well, in a representative survey from 2013, the majority of both Russians and Ukrainians said that they conceived of each other to be closer to themselves than any other ethnic group. While this doesn't necessarily mean that this close connection is perceived as something positive, it makes clear that there are a lot of people who see Ukraine and Russia as being very similar or close to each other. The idea that Ukrainians and Russians are closely linked goes back to the cradle of European nationalism, the 19th century, and perhaps even beyond. The idea that these two ethnic groups are, quote, brother peoples, with Russia as the big and Ukraine as the little brother, was especially pushed during the reign of the monarchs who came to control the territory on which both the Russian and Ukrainian ethnic groups lived, the Tsars. The idea of Russia as the big and Ukraine as the little brother seemingly correlated with the well-established terms of Big Russia, present-day Russia, and Little Russia, present-day Ukraine, that were originally used without any negative connotations. Believe it or not, when used by inhabitants of the medieval state known as the Kievan Rus, which controlled much of present-day Ukraine as well as Western Russia, the two terms simply describe the geographic distance between each area and Constantinople, with Little Russia being little because the distance to the East Roman capital city was smaller. In the 16th and 17th century, the term Little Russia was revived and reinterpreted by people who advocated for a closer connection between the two ethnic groups. Eventually, the term was given a negative connotation by nationally minded Ukrainians, who used it to refer to Ukrainians who submitted to Russian cultural and linguistic hegemony, like little brothers who subordinated themselves to their older sibling. But I feel like, by this point, many of us already know this. We know that in Russia, the dominant narrative is that Ukraine is an offshoot of Russia, in some ways dependent on and definitely less powerful and culturally significant than its bigger brother. But where did this hierarchical understanding of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship come from? And while we're looking for it, where did the Ukrainian narrative that they were not Russia's little brother come from? To do that, we're going to have to go back in time. Over the course of the past year, many of us will have come across the Kievan Rus, the medieval state which serves as the origin myth for both modern-day Russia and Ukraine. Around the year 988, the Kievan ruler Volodymyr in Ukrainian, called Vladimir in Russian, was baptized and married the sister of the Roman Emperor, the Eastern Roman Emperor, as contemporary Catholics would have been sure to point out, which set in motion the process of the Christianization of Kievan Rus. Today, he is considered a saint in the Orthodox Church. For, since this is Eastern Rome we're talking about here, the Kievan Rus was Christianized into the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, I'm not just saying this as a callback to our exploration of how the Byzantine Empire never existed. As we're going to find out, Russian identity is closely connected to the Russian Orthodox Church, which is itself a part of the larger family of the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Kievan Rus has become the object of many historiopolitical controversies. Putin frequently mentions it in his speeches, using the family metaphor, an idea that holds that the people who inhabited the Kievan Rus shared a common ancestor in order to underline that the Ukrainians and Russians are genetically linked, and considers that Dnieper, the river which runs through Kiev, the joint baptismal front of both nations. But Putin also does more than this. He believes, and he's stated so publicly in his addresses, that the Kievan Rus is the cultural and political predecessor of modern-day Russia, and sees Volodymyr, or as he would refer to him as, Vladimir, as the founder of the Russian nation. Ukraine, likewise, has integrated much of the symbols of the Kievan Rus into their state symbolism. For example, it uses the trident, the official symbol of Volodymyr, as its coat of arms. Its currency, the hryvnia, was named after the Kievan Rus' currency. Until recently, as well, most of Ukraine's population has been Eastern Orthodox, with the notable exception of Catholic unions in western Ukraine, a region which for a long time was under the rule of the Catholic Polish and later Habsburg kingdoms. But back to the Rus. According to contemporary European historians, the area of the Kievan Rus was first settled by the Varangians, a tribe from Scandinavia, in around 750 AD. And this simple fact, this one thing that I've told you as the starting point of this story, is still being challenged by Ukrainian and Russian nationalists up until this day. Because the time of the Kievan Rus is regarded by both nationalist groups as the golden age of their peoples, and neither appreciates having non-Slavic actors as part of their national myths, or histories as they would call them. But nevertheless, the Kievan Rus is the starting point of these two separate narratives, which explain to these two countries who they are. And the main disagreement, the reason why people are dying in Ukraine today, is the question of whether Ukrainians and Russians are in fact two different people. Both, after all, claim that they come from the same place. Russian nationalist historians don't disagree with Ukrainian nationalists that the Kievan Rus was the beginning of their nation. They simply say that their nation is Russia. In order to understand how these two very different conceptions were constructed over the course of history, we need to delve, as many of you will probably have already guessed, into the nationalist historiographies of these two countries. The first comprehensive history of Russia that has been passed down to us was written in 1674. The synopsis, or Kievan synopsis, was written by an Orthodox scholar who lived and taught in today's Ukraine. And, just a heads up at this point, we're going to run into Russian scholars using the term Russia to refer to different things than what we might think of Russia as. So, for example, the synopsis calls the Kievan Rus Kievan Russia and identifies it as the first Russian state. This text canonizes a sequence of quote-unquote Russian capital cities, starting in Kiev and then moving to Moscow and later St. Petersburg. Herein, the synopsis was asserting a narrative of continuity, a concept we've encountered before in Transylvania, between the Kievan Rus and the Russian Empire. And, as we've learned from studying Transylvania, when historians set out to prove continuity, they're probably doing so because this continuity is in doubt. See, the Kievan Rus was a medieval federation of East Slavic tribes centered in what is now Ukraine and parts of modern-day Russia. At its height, it was one of the largest and most prosperous states in Europe. However, by the late 12th century, the Kievan Rus was in a state of decline, marked by internal political struggles and invasions by neighboring powers. In the 13th century, The Mongols, known as the Golden Horde because of the color of the horde of tents they pitched before battle, conquered the Kievan Rus and established a state known as the Mongol Empire. The Golden Horde ruled over the territories of the former Kievan Rus for over 250 years, with a heavy hand and significant cultural and political influence. But despite the Golden Horde's domination, over time, one of its vassal states, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, based in modern-day Western Russia, in what used to be the eastern provinces of the Kievan Rus, gradually became more powerful, eventually leaving the Golden Horde and becoming an independent political actor. In 1547, its ruling Grand Prince Ivan crowned himself Tsar and renamed the country the Tsardom of Russia. In the late 17th and early 18th century, the Tsardom expanded significantly, acquiring territories in modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. By the end of the 18th century, the Tsardom of Russia, now rechristened the Russian Empire, had become a major European power, continuing to expand until the collapse of the empire in the Russian Revolution of 1917. Up until this day, however, historians following the Russian tradition argue for a continuity of the quote-unquote Russian state, starting from the Kievan Rus up until the 21st century. This idea, the continuity of one state or dynasty, became especially popular under Tsar Nicholas I, who wanted to establish an imperial ideology based on the concept of nationality, and to manifest his power amid the age of the Enlightenment. Influenced by these ideals, modern Russian historiography, which emerged under Nicholas's rule in the first half of the 19th century, canonized the continuity from the Kievan Rus, or Kievan Russia, to Tsar Nicholas's empire, as well as the family metaphor, which, as you already know, is the idea that Russia is a big brother from whom younger siblings, other Slavic-speaking peoples, had been separated. 19th century scholars Sergei Solovev and Vasily Hruševsǩyj expanded on this idea. Both argued that a Russian state was founded during the time of the Kievan Rus, and was continued and found its culmination under the reign of the Tsars. This narrative of a continuous history was also applied to the history of the Orthodox Church, its beginning being Vladimir's baptism in Kiev, and its culmination the establishment of the Patriarchate of Moscow. This focus on the Orthodox Church was not without its political motivations. At this point, the rulers of Moscow had taken up a new mantle: the Third Rome. A new continuity was added to Moscow's repertoire of historical claims, and this one went Rome to Constantinople to Moscow. And there's one little fact you need to know for this. In the 11th century, the Christian church had split. It's a long story, and politics and theological arguments both play a role, but suffice it to say that by the end of the Middle Ages, Western Christendom adhered to the conception of Christianity promoted by the popes, called Catholicism, and the eastern half of the Christian world, including the Kievan Rus and its successor states, adhered to the version of Christianity promoted by the Roman Empire and the ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, called Orthodox Christianity. So, basically, the Tsars and their historians argued that the cultural, political, and spiritual legacy of the East Roman Empire was continued by the Orthodox Church after the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Moscow, the only remaining center of Orthodox Christianity not conquered by a Muslim state, thus saw itself as the new bearer of orthodoxy, and thus bearer of the legacy of Rome itself. Now, the Orthodox Church was, and still is, structured as a network of self-governing churches, with the ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople considered a first among equals over the Orthodox bishops. In the late 17th century, the Orthodox Church in Ukraine came under the religious jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Moscow, who was the head of the Russian branch of the Orthodox Church. Now, this may sound familiar to some of you, because many Ukrainians saw the Moscow Patriarchate as a symbol of Russian domination, and in recent years, there's been an effort by some Ukrainian Orthodox Christians to establish an independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is separate from the Moscow Patriarchate. See, I told you that Byzantium episode was going to pay off. But anyway, I've gotten off track here. These scholars were providing a foundation for Russians, in particular the rulers of Russia, the Tsars, to envision a cultural similarity between Russians and Ukrainian that enables one to believe what most Russians believe up until this day. I'm talking about the belief that Russia, as an ethnic, national, and religious entity, has existed continuously for over 1,000 years. This way of interpreting history strips the term Ukraine of all meaning and assigns it a new one as a subcategory of the concept of Russia. In other words, Russians now saw Ukrainians as a kind of Russian people, which fundamentally denies Ukrainians the ability to conceive of themselves as a people separate to Russians and Russia and Russianness. Now, not all nationalist historians agreed on this version of events. Mikhail Pogodin, another Russian imperialist historian from the 19th century, tried to explain continuity by asserting that the Russian population of the Kievan Rus had escaped the Mongols in the 13th century by moving to the northeast of Russia, and that, later on, the Ukrainians had moved to the Kievan area from the west. In other words, that the Ukrainian ethnic group had never been a part of the Kievan Rus. But most, including Sergei Solovyev and Vasily Hruševsǩyj, adhere to the story that Ukrainians were and had always been a subset of Russians, and that it was Russia which was the inheritor of the legacy of the Kievan Rus. But of course, all of this, even the disagreements, is just half of this story. Or should I say, one of these stories. The other story was being told by Ukrainians. Just like Russian scholars, Ukrainian historians claim the Kievan Rus as the founding basis for the state of Ukraine. The most notable historians who promoted this theory unsurprisingly also wrote in the 19th century. Or mostly. Similar to the Russian narrative, the Ukrainians see themselves as the first and therefore rightful settlers of the Kievan Rus. This perspective was first canonized in the Istoria Rusov, the History of the Rus, which was written around 1800 by an anonymous author. The main argument of the book is that the continuity went from the Kievan Rus to the Cossacks. The Cossacks? It's a word I've heard before, but up until this year I never really understood what they were. See, the Cossacks were a group of people who emerged in the southern border region of the Russian Empire, the Kingdom of Poland, and the Crimean Khanate in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, on the territory of modern-day central and eastern Ukraine. They were not directly related to the Kievan Rus. They were made up of various East Slavic tribes, and included some which had at one part been part of the Kievan Rus. But they had their own political structures, the hetmanates, which centered around the river Dnieper, and many of their people were men and women who had fled from either the Russian Empire, Poland, or the Crimean Khanate, which also explains the hetmanate's nature as being pretty much against all of its neighbors, only able to survive because these neighbors were also all in competition with each other. Once this competition had ended, when the Russian Empire conquered the Crimean Khanate and the eastern-border parts of Poland, the Cossacks were quickly subsumed by the empire. Now, all of this should make clear that it's pretty difficult to say that the Cossacks were in any way a purely ethnic group. It seems, at least from what I've seen, read, and heard, that they were a coming together of, at many times, refugees from other powers who mixed to create a society of their own. But regardless of the truth of a ethnic, homogeneous Ukrainian identity of the Cossacks, we can see that once again the question of continuity becomes supremely important. Mychajlo Maximovich and Vladimir Antonovich, two Ukrainian historians, sought to prove unbroken continuity of settlement in the Kiev region from the Middle Ages to modern-day Ukraine. The basic idea here was that the people who first settled in and around Kiev, the Ukrainian Cossacks, as they called them, didn't just continuously inhabit this area, but also ethnically stayed the same people. And here we also need to note how the question of ethnicity becomes really important to this story. Because there was no continuity of state in Ukraine, this means that if you're a historian arguing for the Ukrainian perspective, you have to focus on the history of the Ukrainians as an ethnic group. This was also true for Antonovich student Mychajlo Hruševsųkyj, a Ukrainian historian who taught at the University of Lviv in Galicia around the turn of the 20th century, which at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hruševsųkyj presented a radical counter-argument to the imperialist Russian narrative. He argued that it is only the Ukrainian people, which in this case should be read as the Ukrainian ethnic group, which can be linked to the Kievan Rus. In this version of the story, the Rus is equivalent to a Ukrainian empire, a political structure that is older than the principalities in the Rus' northeast, which Hruševsųkyj considers predecessors of the Moscow state. Right, so we've got two historical narratives which lead to radically different interpretations of what the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians has been in the past, is like today, and should be like in the future. You can probably already fill in the blanks of how this could lead to war. There are enough openings for nationalists to make territorial claims which conflict with one another, but I want to take a look at how it did lead to war. I mean, this is a discourse which has its roots in the 17th century. How and why did it lead to war now? Well, we left off in the 19th century, a time when nationalism was becoming more and more popular, when historians in not just Russia and Ukraine, but all over Europe were writing histories of their nations in order to legitimate their own national projects. But I'd like to go a little bit further back in time and explore which concepts of Russia existed in Russia before the times of Nicholas I. In other words, what did Russians mean when they said the word Russia? And, while we're at it, why did Russia prove to be such a fertile soil for the nationalist narratives of people like Soloviev and Hruševsųkyj? As we've already seen, after the fall of Constantinople, Russia came to see itself as the new global center of Christian orthodoxy. Its exceptional religious role became a source of prestige for the rising power. Over the course of the 17th century, however, this primarily religious identity began to be linked to ethnic and linguistic factors. Scholars like Protopopen Avvakum advocated the use of Russian in religious services as opposed to what had been traditionally used during Mass: Greek and Old Church Slavonic. Now, this latter one, for your information, was a Slavic language, but its use had for a long time now been restricted to religious contexts, and it therefore wasn't seen as a language which could be called a language representing the Russian people. So, it's at this point that we see the coming together of two early and important pillars of Russian identity: religion and language. And now remember, even now, about 80% of Ukrainian citizens are Christian Orthodox. And Ukrainian, a language with over 30 million native speakers, is closely related to the Russian language. If faith and language were sufficient criteria to identify who and what is Russian, well, where would that leave Ukrainians? Or, moreover, what if you were to say that Ukrainian isn't really a language of its own? Because some people in Russia have even gone so far as to say that Ukrainian is not a language of its own. Rather, it's simply a dialect of Russian, and that there is no linguistic, cultural, or historical basis for considering Ukrainian to be a separate language. It's a theory which, by the way, has been widely discredited and rejected by linguistic experts and the majority of Ukrainian and international scholars. While the two share some similarities due to their common Slavic origins, these do not suffice to consider them anything else than separate languages. However, if you do support that theory, then the difference between Ukrainians and Russians does look vanishingly small. And there's more. At the same time, the concept of a divinely legitimized ruler and their harmonic relationship with the people was gaining traction in Tsarist Russia. We've heard of this concept before, remember? What legitimated the rule of an East Roman emperor? Divine right. Based on this concept and a Russian identity that was closely linked to being a subject of such a good Tsar, Peter the Great and Catherine II, also known as the Great, promoted a Russian imperial patriotism which was supra-ethnic and included non-Russian speaking subjects as well as non-Orthodox Christians and Muslims within the empire. Unsurprisingly, for a time before nationalism became a big thing, the Russian rulers in Moscow didn't identify their subjects as Russians based on their ethnicity. Rather, you are a Russian if you are ruled, or, in later interpretations, ever were ruled by a Russian Tsar. This imperial conception of identity wasn't unopposed. People who did indeed identify as ethnic Russians objected to the supra-ethnic concept of Russianness because they found it too westernized and feared secularization. By the 1730s, Russian aristocrats had begun protesting the apparent predominance of non-Russians at the Tsar's court. At the same time, German historians at the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg faced opposition for identifying the German Varangians as the alleged founders of the Russian state. And remember, these were the ones who had founded the Kievan Rus in around 750 AD, the fact which Russians and Ukrainian nationalists are still debating to this day. Well, now we know that already in the 18th century were historians being criticized for degrading the historical role of Russianness in Russian history. But nevertheless, this early quest for a Russian identity was, again, dominated by two opposing forces. Proponents of the concept of a multi-ethnic imperial Russia and those trying to strengthen an ethnic Russian identity. The latter laid the foundation for what would become an ethno-nationalist movement in the 19th century, reacting to nationalist movements all over Europe at the same time. And this is something that I found really interesting when I first heard of this fact. The theory that the Kievan Rus was the beginning of Russia was a compromise solution which satisfied both historiographical narratives. In this, it was seen as both the cradle of territorial and ethnic Russia. The golden age of the Rus was now considered an origin myth for all Slavic people, which one day were to be reunited under a divinely sanctioned Russian leadership. From this point of view, the reunion of Russia and Ukraine would be seen as progress, or better yet, the righting of a historical wrong. And as we all know, this perspective is alive and well today. In connection to this Russian search for a proper definition of Russianness, I encountered the thesis of late nations. Coined by the sociologist Helmut Plessner, this theory argues that both countries have only existed as nation-states for a quarter of a century. In other words, that their formation was rather quote-unquote late when compared to other contemporary European states. After the Soviet Union and its sense of identity centered on the philosophy of communism had collapsed, this ideological vacuum was filled with nationalist narratives and thus nationalist historiographies. Historians like Hruševsጵkyj in Russia and Hruševsጵkyj in Ukraine, with their national, imperialistic, and ethno-nationalist approaches, respectively, were used as an orientation and as role models for contemporary historians, which led such historians in both countries to return to these two incompatible narratives. Plessner further argues that, as opposed to many countries in Western Europe, for most of its existence, the Russian state didn't aid the formation of a Russian nation. The authoritarian rule of the Tsars, and later the communist rule of the Soviet Union, prevented the organic democratic development and political emancipation of Russian society, and their integration into a nation of citizens. Geoffrey Hosking argues in his book Russia, Nation and Empire that the imperialist Russian approach to national identity didn't allow for a formation of a nation of citizens. Now, the idea that some nations are quote-unquote late seems a bit strange to me. It sounds like Western European democratic nation-states looking into the East and thinking that the countries over there will necessarily have to look like them at some point and now need to catch up. But on the other hand, nationalism did fill a vacuum in the post-Soviet world, and these nationalists, which, as we can now see, have been in power in Russia for some time now, certainly had the goal of creating a nation-state. So perhaps we should see this as a comparatively recent trend, one which started after the Cold War and was conditional upon nationalists seizing power and trying to remake the state according to their own desires. Ukraine, at the same time, was confronted with the challenges of combining the concepts of the ethnic nation and the nation of citizens. During and after its formation, the question whether a Ukrainian nation even existed was disputed not only within Russia, but also by European scholars and officials. In 2014, after Russia's unilateral annexation of Crimea, former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt said, and I quote, "Ukraine is an independent state that is not a nation-state. It's disputed among historians whether there is a Ukrainian nation at all." End quote. Hosking argues that both Russia and Ukraine still are young nations, struggling to form a national identity, an instability that influences their internal developments as well as their bilateral relationship. And even though I'm still uncomfortable with using the term late, because it implies a natural endpoint, a teleology at which every state will arrive at sooner or later, I have to say that his observation that it's only been 30-odd years that both countries have been able to explore what it means to be a nation has a point. The instability which Hosking argues that this recency brings with it partly explains the close link between Russian and Ukrainian nation-building. The Russian nation was imagined as a quote-unquote all-Russian or a threefold nation, including Belarusians and Ukrainian, using the term Ruski mir, the Russian world in English. We've already come across this idea. The concept that all, or at least some Eastern Slavic ethnic groups, have a close connection or are even related to one another. The version of this theory that gained traction after the collapse of the Soviet Union puts Ukrainians as well as Belarusians, the third East Slavic ethnic group which speak the Belarusian language, in an especially close relationship to Russians, which, in turn, provides the foundation for present-day Russian arguments in favor of close political collaboration with, or even control by, Russia of these two other groups. At the same time, the core element of Ukrainian nation-building has become the demarcation from its former imperial overlords. This means that we are again faced with an irreconcilable difference between the Russian and Ukrainian views of history, and thus with irreconcilable differences in their respective understandings of Ukrainian and Russian identity. At this point, I just want to say something more about nation building. We now know that nations are constructed over time. The next thing which we need to understand is that one of the big implications of this knowledge is that no nation which exists today was ever fated to come to be. They're the products of their history, and that history is contingent. There is no preordained end product to the process of nation building. It's the reason why Andreas Kappeler has even advocated getting rid of the term altogether and replacing it with the term building a nation. Kappeler believes that it helps us understand that these are projects that don't always lead to the desired outcome, that they are processes without an endpoint which are subject to historical circumstances. Neither Ukraine nor Russia's existence was preordained. They exist because history unfolded in a certain way, because circumstances which were favorable to building their nations let them grow. And one thing that almost all scholars of Ukraine agree on right now is that this war, the war Vladimir Putin started to make Ukraine a part of Russia, is the single largest contributing factor which is speeding up the process of Ukrainian nation building right now. But we also need to keep in mind that this is a war that didn't start on February the 24th. It began in 2014, when Russian-backed pro-Russian separatists seized power in the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as on the Crimean Peninsula. That was when the war started. That was when the question of whether or not they wanted to be a part of Russia was first dramatically posed to the Ukrainians alive today. Except it wasn't posed to all of them. those Ukrainians which lived in the regions in which Russian-backed separatists took power never had the freedom to contemplate which nation they belonged to. The decision was imposed upon them by the militants which seized control of their regions. Timothy Snyder, the now famous Yale-based American historian of Ukraine, argued in his 2018 book The Road to Unfreedom that after the war had started, these Ukrainians were subjected to pro-Russian propaganda, and because they were on the pro-Russian side of the front lines, they were shelled and bombed by the army of Ukraine. By Ukraine. Snyder portrayed this as an insidious process which moved Ukrainians to take up arms against their own people. But now that we know what we know about the building of nations, I think we need to think about this another way. The citizens of the breakaway Donetsk and Luhansk regions never experienced the nation-building events of the near decade between 2014 and 2022. They have been exposed to a media environment which wanted them to identify as Russian, and experienced first-hand violence doled out by the Ukrainian state. To quote Snyder himself, "Over and over, Ukrainian citizens who joined the separatists in summer 2014 said that it was the death of women, children, and the aged from artillery that inspired them to take up arms. A survey suggested that this experience, rather than an ideology such as separatism or Russian nationalism, was the main motivation of Ukrainian citizens who chose to fight against the Ukrainian army." End quote. What Snyder doesn't seem to take into account is that these experiences themselves can create nationalist sentiments, nationalist feelings of belonging, nationalist ideologies. Never mind that this violence was being used by the Ukrainian military for the simple purpose of reasserting control over its own territory, which an authoritarian dictator was trying to take away from it. I'm not trying to side with Putin on this. What I want to communicate to you is that there is a real possibility that should Ukraine advance militarily into regions which have been under Russian or pro-Russian control since 2014, they might encounter people who, in the meantime, have come to perceive their identity differently to how the rest of Ukraine conceives it. And again, I don't want to provide a value judgment on this. I just want to highlight that I believe that this could be an issue which might arise in the future, and it's not an issue that's being talked about right now. I also don't want to say that all the people living in these regions have come to identify as Russian over the course of the past 8 years. We've already seen in this war that there's only a very small minority of Ukrainians which are willing to cooperate with the invaders, who want to associate themselves with Russia. But still, there are some. In fact, the mayor of Bakhmut recently gave an interview in which he vented frustration at not being able to get the last 600 residents to leave the city, despite it being actively fought over very intensely by the Russian army and the Ukrainians. In the interview, he said that he suspected that some of these citizens probably wanted the Russians to take control. So, there might be some Ukrainians who still think fondly of Russia despite all that has happened. What I want to propose is that in the areas under pro-Russian control since 2014, that percentage of the population might go from being vanishingly small to something larger. And I don't know how that's going to be handled, or how it should be handled. One last thing I want to address. Up until now, we've only been looking at Ukrainian and Russian conceptions of their own history. But given the large role that foreign military aid is playing in the conflict right now, I think there's a valid point in taking some time to examine how people outside of Ukraine and Russia, especially those from the Western countries who have become Ukraine's closest backers in this war, have seen this region's history. And, well, what I've found out is that, until recently, Western perspectives on the Russian-Ukrainian relationship have been dominated by the Russian narrative. We saw this already in former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt's quote I recounted to you earlier. The Ukrainian narrative, as espoused by the likes of Hruševsųkyj, tended to be disregarded as nationalist. These preconceptions only began to change in the 2010s and have only now intensified since the beginning of the war. It's A change in mentality that becomes evident when one looks at the terminology Western historians have used to describe this history. Only recently has there been a shift away from using the term Kievan Russia or Ancient Russia, which, remember, is what the author of the first history of Russia called it in the 17th century. Is a term which has been used to describe the Kievan Rus by Russian nationalist historians since then, even though most Western academics will say that the dispute over whether the Kievan Rus was Russian or Ukrainian, the dispute which is so closely linked to both nations' constructions of their own past, is entirely unproductive. In doing so, the modern term nation is projected back onto the Middle Ages, remember, which is a time when nationalism didn't exist. It is a time, in other words, when neither Russians nor Ukrainians existed in our modern conceptions of these identities. That's why historians like Andreas Kappeler argue that you can't say whether the Kievan Rus was either Russian or Ukrainian. But that doesn't change the fact that in Russia and Ukraine, these essentialist interpretations by leading national historians still possess an almost canonical character in their national historiography. It's only recently that international historians have started calling the medieval state the Kievan Rus. We've also started calling the Ukrainian capital city Kyiv and not Kiev, the Russian word for the capital. And most recently, we've been referring to the war as a war and not a special military operation. But all jokes aside, these terms aren't just words. They have power. They shape the way we see the world, how we make sense of it, and who we think is in the right. Andreas Kappeler has noted that the predominance which Russian terminology has long enjoyed in Western historiography reflects the marginalization of Ukrainians and their history in Western Europe. Or, in other words, with those who want to stand up for the values which Ukrainians are giving their lives for right this very moment. The right to national self-determination. Not to mention the right to freedom of speech and liberal democracy. These would-be backers didn't understand that Ukrainians saw themselves as a nation which was culturally separate from Russia and did not want to be a part of Russia. And they didn't understand it because of the dominant position of the Russian narratives in their country's historiographies. Remember Valeria and her brother, the two teenagers from Chernihiv? On that night in February, 3 days before the command was given and the tanks started rolling, they were in Valeria's room watching Russian President Vladimir Putin give a speech on national TV. Here's a quote. "The only thing I would like to say today is that this is exactly how it was. It is a historical fact. Actually, as I have already said, Soviet Ukraine is the result of the Bolsheviks' policy and can be rightfully called Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. He was its creator and architect." End quote. Putin is here referring to the theory that it was communist leader Vladimir Lenin's decision to give Ukraine autonomy within Bolshevik Russia which created Ukraine as an entity. Which, by the way, disregards the fact that no more than a decade before that, the Bolsheviks had to conquer a separate Ukrainian political entity in the Russian Civil War. But that's a story for another time, and I think we've underlined enough how this narrative is constructed. But, that's also something I want to say here. In a strange sort of way, Putin is almost getting it. He's so close to grasping the truth that less than a week later was going to smack him in the face. In the words of Andreas Kappeler, nations are not natural occurrences. Like I told you in our short episode on the concept of nationalism, nations are social and historical constructs. They're constructs of the ideas and imaginations of the humans who imagine to be a part of them. These entities are constructed over time and not handed down to us from some dark mists of creation. Vladimir Putin tried to delegitimize Ukraine's station as a nation. Nay, he thought that Ukraine was not in fact a nation at all precisely because it was constructed. The only thing that he forgot to take into account is that all nations are constructed, and that doesn't make them any less real. In fact, it was due to the version of what Russians consider Russia to be, which became predominant in Russian historiography, that Putin made the mistake to invade Ukraine in the first place. Because Putin, guided by his country's Tsarist nationalist narrative, was convinced that Ukraine was not in fact a nation of its own, but part of the Russian quote-unquote family, he thought that he wouldn't meet any resistance if he invaded. It's why his soldiers were told to pack their dress uniforms on the way to Kiev. It was the reality of a Ukrainian nation which had come into existence over the course of history that those uniforms were found, months later, in abandoned Russian military vehicles by Ukrainian men and women who had just pushed back Russian forces from the gates of Kiev and were determined to defend their homeland from what they saw as an unjustified foreign invasion. But Vladimir Putin and his lackeys weren't the only ones whose historical misconceptions had real-world consequences. It was because Western liberal democracies didn't understand that Ukraine didn't want to be a part of Russia and was willing to shoulder the heaviest of all costs to remain independent, that they didn't intervene earlier in a way which might have deterred Putin, or at least shortened the bloodshed by aiding Ukraine to repulse what was clearly an invasion based on entirely incorrect historical assumptions. On February 24th, many people in the West were flabbergasted by Putin's decision to invade a neighboring country. It's only if we understand which historical narratives Putin believes, and thus what he believes the world around him to be like, that this decision becomes less incomprehensible. And that, at the end of the day, is why I wanted to make this podcast. It's because I think that this is the reason we need to study history. It's because the way we understand history to have taken place, the way in which history was taught to us, the narratives we were raised with, impact the way we see not only how the world around us does look like, but how it should look like. It is only if we study history, and especially the way that other people see history as having unfolded, the historiography of other countries, in other words, that we can understand the rationales along which politicians in these countries make decisions as large as telling their soldiers to go to war. Back when I was writing my bachelor's thesis on the wars in Yugoslavia, another instance of ethnically charged conflicts which international mediators knew very little about when they began, I came across a quote from Richard Holbrooke, the American diplomat who negotiated the end to the Bosnian War. Quote, "There will be other Bosnias in our lives, different in every detail, but similar in one overriding manner. They will originate in distant and ill-understood places, explode with little warning, and present the world with difficult choices." End quote. Well, if diplomats and politicians like Holbrooke had studied their history, maybe they could have prevented them. Maybe Valeria could still be watching videos on YouTube with her brother today. This podcast was written and researched by Susanne Schmalwieser. It was recorded and edited by me, Koloman Marshik. The music was composed by Matthias Cantini, and all artwork was designed by Andrew Holt.